Welcome back, fourth graders. Just to let you know, if the video cuts off at a certain point, it's because it cuts off after 15 minutes. So each day I'll pick up where I left off. We ended with Elia deciding not to marry Myra because he noticed that she wasn't the woman that he thought that she was. The next time the water truck came in, it was driven by Mr. Pandansky, who also brought sack lunches. Stanley sat with his back against a pile of dirt and ate. He had a bologna sandwich, potato chips, and a large chocolate chip cookie. "How you doing?" asked Magnet. "Not real good," said Stanley. "Well, the first hole's the hardest," Magnet said. Stanley took a deep breath. He couldn't afford to dawdle. He was way behind the others, and the sun just kept getting hotter. It wasn't even noon yet. But he didn't know if he had the strength to stand up. He thought about quitting. He wondered what they would do to him. What could they do to him? His clothes were soaked with sweat. In school, he had learned that sweating was good for you. It was nature's way of keeping you cool. So why was he so hot? Using his shovel for support, he managed to get to his feet. "Where are we supposed to go to the bathroom?" he asked Magnet. Magnet gestured with his arms to the great expanse around them. "Pick a hole, any hole," he said. Stanley staggered across the lake, almost falling over a dirt pile. Behind him, he heard Magnet say, "But first, make sure nothing's living in it." After leaving Myra's house, Elia wandered aimlessly through the town until he found himself down by the wharf. He sat on the edge of a pier and stared down into the cold black water. Excuse me. He could not understand how Myra had trouble deciding between him and Igor. He thought she loved him. Even if she didn't love him, couldn't she see what a foul person Igor was? It was like Madame Zeroni had said. Her head was as empty as a flower pot. Some men were gathering on another dock, and he went to see what was going on. A sign read, "Deck hands wanted, free passage to America." He had no sailing experience, but the ship's captain signed him aboard. The captain could see that Elia was a man of great strength. Not everybody could carry a full-grown pig up the side of a mountain. It wasn't until the ship had cleared the harbor and was heading out across the Atlantic that he suddenly remembered his promise to carry Madame Zeroni up to the mountain. He felt terrible. He wasn't afraid of the curse. He thought that was a lot of nonsense. He felt bad because he knew Madame Zeroni had wanted to drink from the stream before she died. Zero was the smallest kid in Group D, but he was the first one to finish digging. "You're finished?" Stanley asked enviously. Zero said nothing. Stanley walked to Zero's hole and watched him measure it with his shovel. The top of his hole was a perfect circle, and the sides were smooth and steep. Not one dirt clod more than necessary had been removed from the earth. Zero pulled himself up to the surface. He didn't even smile. He looked down at his perfectly dug hole, spat in it, then turned and headed back to the camp compound. "Zero's one weird dude," said Zigzag. Stanley would have laughed, but he didn't have the strength. Zigzag had to be the weirdest dude Stanley had ever seen. He had a long, skinny neck and a big round head with a wild, frizzy blonde hair that stuck out in all directions. His head seemed to bop up and down on his neck, like it was on a spring. Armpit was the second one to finish digging. He also spat into his hole before heading back to the camp compound. One by one, Stanley watched each of the boys spit into his hole and return to the campground. Stanley kept digging. His hole was almost up to his shoulders, although it was hard to tell exactly where ground level was because his dirt pile completely surrounded the hole. The deeper he got, the harder it was to raise the dirt up and out of the hole. Once again, he realized he was going to have to move the piles. His cap was stained with blood from his hands. He felt like he was digging his own grave. In America, Elia learned to speak English. He fell in love with a woman named Sarah Miller. She could push a plow, milk a goat, and most importantly, think for herself. She and Elia often stayed up half the night talking and laughing together. Their life was not easy. Elia worked hard, but bad luck seemed to follow him everywhere. He always seemed to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. He remembered Madame Zeroni telling him that she had a son in America. Elia was forever looking for him. He'd walk up to complete strangers and ask if they knew someone named Zeroni, or had ever heard of anyone named Zeroni. No one did. Elia wasn't sure what he'd do if he ever found Madame Zeroni's son anyway. Carry him up a mountain and sing the pig lullaby to him? After his barn was struck by lightning for the third time, he told Sarah about his broken promise to Madame Zeroni. "I'm worse than a pig thief," he said. "You should leave me and find someone who isn't cursed." "I'm not leaving you," said Sarah, "but I want you to do one thing for me." "Anything," said Elia. Sarah smiled. "Sing me the pig lullaby." He sang it for her. Her eyes sparkled. "That's so pretty. What does it mean?" Elia tried his best to translate it from Latvian to English, but it wasn't the same. "It rhymes in Latvian," he told her. "I could tell," said Sarah. A year later, their son was born. Sarah named him Stanley because she noticed that Stanley was Yelnats spelled backwards. Sarah changed the words of the pig lullaby so that it rhymed, and every night she sang it to little Stanley. If only, the woodpecker sighs, the bark on the tree was as soft as the skies, while the wolf waits below, hungry and lonely, crying to the moon, if only, if only. Remember, that's the same song that Stanley's dad also sings. Stanley's hole was as deep as his shovel, but not quite wide enough on the bottom. He grimaced as he sliced off a chunk of dirt, then raised it up and flung it onto a pile. He laid his shovel back down on the bottom of his hole, and to his surprise, it fit. He rotated it and only had to chip off a few chunks of dirt here and there before it could lie flat across his hole in every direction. He heard the water truck approaching and felt a strange sense of pride at being able to show Mr. Sir or Mr. Pendanski that he had dug his first hole. He put his hands on the rim and tried to pull himself up. He couldn't do it. His arms were too weak to lift his heavy body. He used his legs to help, but it just didn't have enough strength. He was trapped in his hole. It was almost funny, but he wasn't in the mood to laugh. "Stanley?" he heard Mr. Pendanski call. Using his shovel, he dug 2 footholes in the hole wall. He climbed out to see Mr. Pendanski walking over to him. "I was afraid you'd fainted," Mr. Pendanski said. "You wouldn't have been the first." "I'm finished," Stanley said, putting his blood-spotted cap back on his head. "All right," said Mr. Pendanski, raising his hand for a high five, but Stanley ignored it. He didn't have the strength. Mr. Pendanski lowered his head and looked down at Stanley's hole. "Well done," he said. "You want to ride back?" Stanley shook his head. "I'll walk." Mr. Pendanski climbed into the truck without filling Stanley's canteen. Stanley waited for him to drive away, then took another look at his hole. He knew it was nothing to be proud of, but he felt proud nonetheless. He sucked up his last bit of saliva and spat. Chapter 8. A lot of people don't believe in curses. A lot of people don't believe in yellow-spotted lizards either. But if one bites you, it doesn't make a difference whether you believe in it or not. Actually, it is kind of odd that scientists named the lizard after its yellow spots. Each lizard has exactly 11 yellow spots, but the spots are hard to see on its yellow-green body. The lizard is from 6 to 10 inches long and has big red eyes. In truth, its eyes are yellow, and its skin is around the eyes, which is red, but everyone always speaks of its red eyes. It also has black teeth and a milky white tongue. Looking at one, you would have thought that it should have been named a red-eyed lizard, or black-toothed lizard, or perhaps white-tongued lizard. If you've ever been close enough to see the yellow spots, you're probably dead. The yellow-spotted lizard likes to live in holes, which offer shade from the sun and protection from predatory birds. Up to 20 lizards may live in one hole. They have strong, powerful legs that can leap out of very deep holes to attack their prey. They eat small animals, insects, certain cactus thorns, and the shells of sunflower seeds. Stanley stood in the shower and let the cold water pour over his hot and sore body. It was 4 minutes of heaven. For the second day in a row, he didn't use soap. He was too tired. There was no roof over the shower building, and the walls were raised up 6 inches off the ground, except in the corners. There was no drain in the floor. The water ran out under the walls and evaporated quickly in the sun. He put on his clean set of orange clothes. He returned to his tent, put his duty clothes in his crate, got out his pen and box of stationery, and headed to the rec room. A sign on the door said "Rec Room." Nearly everything in the room was broken. The TV, the pinball machine, the furniture, even the people looked broken, with their worn-out bodies sprawled all over the various chairs and sofas. X-Ray and Armpit were playing pool. The surface of the table reminded Stanley of the surface of the lake. It was full of bumps and holes, because so many people had carved their initials into the felt. There was a hole in the far wall, and an electric fan had been placed in front of it. Cheap air conditioning, at least the fan worked. As Stanley made his way across the room, he tripped over an outstretched leg. "Hey, watch it," said an orange lump on a chair. "You watch it," muttered Stanley, too tired to care. "What do you say?" the lump demanded. "Nothing," said Stanley. The lump rose. He was almost as big as Stanley, and a lot tougher. "You said something." He poked his fat finger at Stanley's neck. "What'd you say?" A crowd quickly formed around them. "Be cool," said X-Ray. He put his hand on Stanley's shoulder. "You don't want to mess with the caveman," he warned. "The caveman's cool," said Armpit. "I'm not looking for trouble," Stanley said. "I'm just tired, that's all." The lump grunted. X-Ray and Armpit led Stanley over to a couch. Squid slid over to make room as Stanley sat down. "Did you see the caveman back there?" X-Ray asked. "The caveman's one tough dude," said Squid, and he lightly punched Stanley's arm. Stanley leaned back against the torn vinyl upholstery. Despite his shower, his body still radiated heat. "I wasn't trying to start anything," he said. The last thing he wanted to do after killing himself all day on the lake was to get in a fight with a boy called Caveman. He was glad X-Ray and Armpit had come to his rescue. "Well, how'd you like your first hole?" asked Squid. Stanley groaned, and the other boys laughed. "Well, the first hole's always the hardest," said Stanley. "No way," said X-Ray. "The second hole's a lot harder. You're hurting before you even get started. If you think you're sore now, just wait and see how you feel tomorrow morning. Right?" "That's right," said Squid. "Plus, the fun's gone," said X-Ray. "The fun?" asked Stanley. "Don't lie to me," said X-Ray. "I bet you always wanted to dig a big hole, right? Am I right?" Stanley had never thought about it before, but he knew better than to tell X-Ray he wasn't right. "Every kid in the world wants to dig great big holes," said X-Ray. "To China, right?" "Right," said Stanley. "See what I mean?" said X-Ray. "That's what I'm saying. But now the fun's gone, and you still got to do it, again and again and again." "Camp Fun and Games," said Stanley. "What's in the box?" asked Squid. Stanley had forgotten he had brought it up. Paper. I was going to write a letter to my mother." "Your mother?" laughed Squid. "She'll worry if I don't." Squid scowled. Stanley looked around the room. This was one place in camp where the boys could enjoy themselves, and what'd they do? They wrecked it. The glass on the TV was smashed as if someone had put his foot through it. Every table and chair seemed to be missing at least one leg. Everything leaned. We're going to pick up here tomorrow.